Yes, very good afternoon to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's talk Paris Agreement. Implementation of this agreement requires economic and, one would say, social transformation based on the best available science. But here's the question. Are enough people on the ground motivated to address climate change?
Yeah, it does require science actually to anchor action, and this action should be one that is projected to be one that can actually solve the climate crisis. But to be honest, people are motivated, particularly people at the community level, because they're suffering the brunt of climate change. We have seen this through the massive movements globally that actually are rising to want to have governments take action. But now the challenge has always been, are our political leaders actually standing up to the task?
So part of the Paris Agreement, from what I read, affirms that that developed countries should actually take the lead in providing financial assistance to countries that are less, endowed and more vulnerable. From your perspective, from your research, is this happening?
This is happening, but not to the scale that is supposed to be able to actually acquire transformational climate action, which can actually cause transformation at the community level. The challenge has always been that commitments that have been made in the past, such as the 100 billion commitments made during the Copenhagen summit, have not been met to the extent that we as the people within the poor nations have expected. And then that would mean, therefore, that climate finance is not flowing to countries as expected. And we have a great finance gap as we talk right now.
Julius, what about technology? What about using technology to fight climate change? Are there any technological frameworks to provide guidance on this issue?
Yes, so within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have the Technology Development and Transfer Mechanism that actually is supposed to ensure technologies that enable access, that enable communities stand against the brunt of climate change, get to be empowered enough to deal with the climate impacts. And the question of whether technologies are actually getting to countries is one that has been a very contentious issue, because then at the context of people who are in the front line of climate change, you would expect that these technologies respond to their needs. But unfortunately, most of the times is that they do not take into cognizance the issues at the local context. And therefore, as good as the technologies would be, then they miss out the local context and also are not really responsive enough to the needs. So they get to lead to some of the things we call maladaptation in the context of adaptation, therefore not solving the actual crisis.
Yeah, that local context is key, isn't it? And when you assess the situation here in Africa and various countries on the continent, in terms of their strategies, in terms of their policies, do you see them making a huge impact in terms of fighting climate change over the last 5 years?
Africa has been making quite some progress actually in policy and climate change governance. And we have seen in most of the countries where we have countries that are actually getting to put in place things to do with the national adaptation plans. Also, we have within this year seen countries bring on board some of the nationally determined contributions within the process whereby they are updating them. And some of the countries like Rwanda was one of the first African countries to actually submit to the UN their commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we are doing what we can in the African context, actually setting in place climate governance systems that respond to the needs of the African continent. But definitely just to say that more needs to be done to empower African governments to put in place responsive frameworks, but importantly, ensure that money flows where it's needed most, and that is to communities who are suffering the brunt of climate change.
But Julius, how do we track progress? Talk to us about the transparency and tracking process. How is it done?
So at the global level, we have countries coming together and wanting to have shared ambition, which is outlined within the Paris Agreement. So to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, each country is supposed to commit to taking its own fair share of action within what we call the common but differentiated principle, where every country has the opportunity to contribute to the problem. And this now has to be monitored and actually has to be reported against each commitment made. So within the global level, we have the transparency framework, which is being developed still. We have some aspects of it not finalized, and the transparency framework should allow countries put each other onto task in terms of commitments made and also what remains to be done in view of the great challenge that we have at hand.
Julius, what if somebody says, look, I've gone through so much over the last year, over the past 10 years, for instance. I've lost my job due to COVID-19. I'm battling to put food on the table. I'm worried about my child in terms of education. Why should I be worried about climate change? What's your answer?
Climate change is happening now, and projections are it will continue happening. And sadly, some of us in the African countries and in the global south will face some of the most devastating implications because our systems, and these are economic systems, these are environmental systems, which we rely highly upon, providing employment at scale within our own nations, then all of that will be ravaged by climate change impacts. And despite all that, what is happening with COVID, climate change will cause tremendous implications even in the longer term, and therefore we cannot afford not to worry about such a great impending challenge, and most importantly, worrying about it now.
Important perspective. Julius, thank you very much indeed for your time. Be well.
Thank you very much.
All right, that was Julius Mbatia from Powershift Africa, live for us in Nairobi, Kenya.